Please welcome our Executive Director, Dr. Georges Benjamin.
Welcome to the Monday General Session. I hope you are experiencing a wonderful annual meeting. This session includes our annual recognition of the Prize recipient, followed by an important discussion about policy-mediated violence led by Angela Glover Blackwell, founder and resident of PolicyLink. But first, I would like some others to bring you greetings.
Greetings and welcome from the great Centennial State of Colorado. We are so excited to be joining APHA Virtual 2020 from colorful Colorado.
We're glad to be joining APHA 2020 virtually from the DC metro area, and we're glad you're here too.
On behalf of the members of the Minnesota Public Health Association, welcome to APHA 2020.
Hello from New Hampshire, known as the Granite State, and welcome to APHA 2020.
Hello from the legendary state of North Dakota. I would like to take a moment to express our gratitude for the work that public health has done on this pandemic. And on the behalf of our members, welcome to APHA 2020.
South Carolina, where sweet tea and southern hospitality reign supreme. Welcome to APHA.
Smoky Mountains, to Music City, to Memphis, home of the blues, Tennessee, the volunteer state, welcomes you to APHA 2020.
Greetings from the Treasure State of Montana. On behalf of our 322 members, welcome to APHA 2020.
Welcome to APHA 2020 from the Delaware Public Health Association and Delaware, the first state.
Also the Blue Hen State. Enjoy your virtual conference experience.
We might be famous for our potatoes, but the views are out of this world. From the Idaho Public Health Association, welcome to the 2020 APHA annual meeting.
From the home of the Razorbacks,
welcome to APHA 2020.
Woo! Pig!
Welcome from the great state of Nevada. From Reno
to Las Vegas, welcome APHA 2020.
Welcome American Public Health Association attendees from Sweet Home, Alabama. Y'all stay safe, roll tide. Okay, War Eagle too.
The 600 members of the Oregon Public Health Association welcome everyone to the 2020 APHA Annual Conference.
Hello from the great state of North Carolina. On behalf of NCPHA's more than 1,000 members, welcome to APHA 2020.
From the great state of Nebraska and home of the unicameral, we want to welcome you to APHA 2020.
Welcome to APHA from the great state of Maryland, home of the Maryland Public Health Association, the oldest state affiliate of APHA, and the beautiful Catoctin Mountains.
Hello from Utah, the home of Arches and Zion National Park. Welcome to APHA 2020.
On behalf of all of our members from Connecticut, welcome to APHA 2020.
Greetings from Wisconsin. In 2018, our association declared racism to be a public health crisis. We hope that you take up similar challenges and have a great conference.
Hello from the great state of New Jersey, the Garden State, home of the first APHA meeting in 1872. On behalf of our members, welcome to APHA 2020.
Wow, what a wonderful recognition from our affiliate leaders. I'd now like to take a moment to acknowledge the 75th anniversary of Community Water Fluoridation, as well as a recognition of the Vision Care Community's 2020 Year of the Eye, inspiring us all to take better care of our eyes, which is especially relevant in today's world. We're spending so much time on our computers. Join me in recognizing these important celebrations. The Fries Prize for Improving Health is awarded annually by the CDC Foundation on behalf of the Fries family and presented annually at the APHA annual meeting. I want to now introduce the President and CEO of the CDC Foundation, Dr. Judy Monroe.
Thank you, Georges. Good evening, everyone.
It's a pleasure to be with you, although under these unusual circumstances. Greg Fries, son of Jim and Sarah Fries, the founders of this prestigious award, is normally with me for this presentation. This evening, though, he will provide remarks after me. I am pleased to have the opportunity to recognize the amazing work of this year's Fries Prize for Improving Health recipient. But first, I want to mention the CDC Foundation, which I lead. The CDC Foundation helps CDC and public health organizations save and improve lives by unleashing the power of collaboration between the philanthropic and private sectors to protect the health, safety, and security of America and the world. And today, we see the power of collaboration in our COVID-19 response. As part of our portfolio of work, the CDC Foundation manages and administers the Fries Foundation's Public Health Award programs, which includes the Fries Prize for Improving Health. The Fries Prize for Improving Health recognizes an individual that has made major accomplishments in health improvement with the general criteria of the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Jim and Sarah Fries created the Fries Prize for Improving Health, and for the past 28 years, their foundation has sponsored this award to recognize individuals and their contributions to making people's lives better through improved health. I thank the Fries family for their steadfastness in honoring health heroes. Recipients of the Fries Prize for Improving Health receive a $60,000 prize. As this year's recipient of the Fries Prize for Improving Health, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha is being honored for exposing the Flint, Michigan water crisis, motivating national changes in community water management, and efforts to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in child health. Dr. Hanna-Attisha is founder and director of the Michigan State University and Hurley Children's Hospital Pediatric Public Health Initiative in Flint. A pediatrician, scientist, activist, and author, Dr. Hanna-Attisha has testified 3 times before the U.S. Congress, been awarded the Freedom of Expression Courage Award by PEN America, has been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, and most recently has been recognized as one of USA Today's Women of the Century for her role in uncovering the Flint water crisis and leading recovery efforts. Dr. Hanna-Attisha's widely acclaimed book, What the Eyes Don't See, A Story of Crisis, Resistance, and Hope in an American City, is a dramatic story of the Flint water crisis and has become a timely playbook of resistance and hope. A 2018 New York Times 100 Notable Book, What the Eyes Don't See, is the story of a city on the ropes that came together to fight for justice, self-determination, and the right to build a better world for its children. Dr. Hanna-Attisha is an inspiration to all of us. Her dedication, advocacy, and perseverance are having a profound effect on keeping children safe and improving the lives of America. I'll now turn to Greg Fries to join me in recognizing Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha as the 2020 Fries Prize for Improving Health recipient.
Thank you, Judy, for that kind introduction and succinct summary of Dr. Hanna-Attisha's accomplishments. When my parents created this award so many years ago, they envisioned recognizing public health heroes in a way that had not been done before and was much needed in the world. These heroes have never been more important than they are to America and the world today during this pandemic. On behalf of my father and the entire Fries family, we are truly honored to present the 2020 Fries Prize for Improving Health to Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha.
Please welcome Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Mr. Fries. I don't think any words can capture how humbled and honored I am to be the recipient of the 2020 Fries Prize for Improving Health. I'm grateful to the James F. and Sarah T. Fries Family Foundation, the CDC Foundation, the Award Selection Committee, and everyone else who has been involved in this most surreal moment. I also understand the gravity of being the first woman recipient in over a decade, and only the fourth woman in the almost 30-year history of the award. On behalf of girls everywhere, especially brown and Black girls who are fighting to improve our public's health, a most sincere thank you. My story is that of an immigrant kid who came to this country when I was 4 years old. At that time, I was embraced by Lady Liberty. My diversity was celebrated. And as such, I grew up confident and competent and committed to service. And it is through that lens, that proud immigrant lens, that I wake up every day to be grateful to be in this country, this land of freedom, opportunity, and democracy, this land of my realized American dream. But I also grew up acutely understanding what injustice can be and what people in power can do to vulnerable populations, both abroad and here at home. And it is with that perspective and privilege that I pledged my career to service, no matter where my community may be. And that's how I found myself as a pediatrician in Flint, in the middle of another preventable public health crisis. The Flint story is about the unthinkable tragedy of people being poisoned by the most basic and necessary thing, water. It's a story, not unlike our current crisis, about failing to respect science and public health, and failing to protect the most vulnerable among us. In Flint, our drinking water source was changed, and it wasn't treated properly, making it about 20 times more corrosive than the water that we had been getting from the Great Lakes. It was so corrosive that it ate up engine parts at a car plant. And even when I say it now, I'm still in disbelief. Our drinking water was corroding car parts, and they were allowed to go back to Great Lakes water. But the people of Flint who knew something was wrong were told to relax, that everything was okay. But it wasn't okay. You know that. For 18 months, this corrosive water leached lead and neurotoxin out of our pipes and into the homes and bodies of families and children. It was preventable, but no one stopped it. It was avoidable, but it happened. I ran up against people and entire systems built not to see, even when they did know. It was an indifference, a willful blindness to certain people, problems, and places. And even as I offered up scientific proof, I was sounding an alarm, blowing a whistle. My science was met with denials and attacks. And I know it's hard to imagine being in the middle of a public health crisis where basic common sense science is dismissed. It took a while, but with persistence and teamwork, our science ultimately spoke truth to power. Eyes began to open, and it became impossible to look away. You probably even remember seeing pictures of brown water coming out of kitchen taps. And since then, I get to spend my days absolutely privileged to build and share our model of hope and recovery. With the same speed and urgency that drove the uncovering of the crisis, it continues in our recovery. As for the damaged lead pipes, they are all being replaced, and that will be done this year. And as for the kids, when I realized there was no magic pill that could take away this crisis, I wish there was something I could just prescribe. I went back to the science of what all kids need to be healthy. And we are leaning on that incredible science, the science of trauma and child development, brain plasticity, and resilience in our recovery, framing this crisis holistically as one added toxicity atop a population already rattled with so much adversity. And incredible science, you know this, has taught us that when children are exposed to trauma, especially repetitive trauma. It disrupts child development and has the potential to leave lifelong scars, ranging from developmental delays to chronic diseases to decreased life expectancy. So now in Flint, we are building that resilience through evidence-based interventions with things like expanded healthcare access, home delivery of children's books, brand new childcare centers, developmental assessments, school health services, food prescriptions, trauma-informed care, citywide mindfulness programming, and so much more. We're also working on the bigger things, the upstream things, the harder to see things that also make people healthy, like economic development, living wage jobs, affordable housing, restorative justice, participatory democracy, and self-determination. I am driven, and I know that you are driven by the words of Frederick Douglass. 150 years ago, he said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." We are determined to create the conditions that build strong children, rather than continue to rely on our children to overcome preventable adversity after adversity. And we're doing this not just for Flint kids, but for kids everywhere. And that's why I'm so excited to be here today and so excited to receive this award, because it's not about Flint, it's about everywhere. The story of Flint's not an isolated story. It shines a spotlight on health injustices everywhere. In Flint, it was poisoned water, but people all over in so many places are poisoned by health inequities, by the systemic conditions that rob our children of their dreams. And the pathogens are many: racism, poverty, gross inequality, lack of access to healthy food, healthy air, and health care, widening disparities and lost opportunities. These are the same conditions that make zip codes and the environments that our children are born into the greatest predictors of where they end up. For so long, we have failed to address these upstream threats that put our patients, our communities, and all of us at risk. And our neighbors and loved ones continue to die preventable deaths, be it from COVID or from the malignancy of racism. But it doesn't have to be this way. And that gets to my favorite part of this story. It's how we can once again learn from Flint. Because as much as what happened in Flint is a story of a crime committed with absolute indifference against some of the most vulnerable people in our country, it's also a story of everyday people, moms and pastors and journalists and activists and lawyers and scientists and students and doctors who refused to look away and came together to challenge the status quo, to resist and to reimagine. And what I've also learned from Flint is that with crisis comes opportunity. And today we find ourselves in the midst of another preventable public health crisis. And for me, the lessons of Flint are now playing out at a national, even global scale. In Flint, we learned about the importance of good governance that values public health. We learned about the necessity to respect science. We learned that public health infrastructure cannot be built overnight, that there's a value to prevention and keeping people healthy. And we learned firsthand about disparities and inequities. These are the same lessons that the nation is now learning with this pandemic. And I hope that they will now finally be addressed. We are at a generation-defining moment of crisis in our nation. Eyes are finally opening to a system that is fractured and broken, that fails to care for each other. Yet once again, I am only filled with hope and inspiration, because my story and this beautiful award is not so much about me, it's about you. It's about all of us and what we do next. Our collective work in improving health is far from finished and quite possibly more important than ever before. What I want you to hear in my story is that I didn't look away. I spoke up and change happened. Let my story serve as a playbook for public health-driven resistance and hope. It may not be about poisoned water in your community, but what keeps you up at night? Is it racism, climate crisis, kids in cages, patriarchy, poverty, preventable pandemics? It's going to look different for every person, but it's on all of us to pay attention, to stay vigilant. We do not have to accept the status quo. We can do better on behalf of each other. We can achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And together, I am certain we will successfully diagnose the pathogens of yesterday and today, and the tomorrow that we build will be healthier, more equitable, and more just. Thank you.
Welcome the moderator of our panel discussion, Angela Glover Blackwell.
Hello, I'm Angela Glover Blackwell, and I'm just delighted to be the moderator of this panel. We're going to talk about state-mediated violence through policy. And we have a terrific panel to help us do that. We have Dr. Anthony Eiton, who is the Senior Vice President of the California Endowment, focusing on the Healthy Communities Initiative. He's also a lecturer in health policy and management. We have the wonderful, who we've just had the opportunity of hearing, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who is Associate Professor of the University of Michigan College of Human Medicine and founder, director of the Pediatric Public Health Initiative, Michigan State University and Hurley Children's Hospital. And we have Dr. David Williams, who is the Florence Sprague Norman and Laura Smart Norman Professor of Public Health at Harvard at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. These are exactly the people that we're going to need as we dive into this issue of policy violence. It's a term that I think we associate with, if you've heard it before, with Reverend Barber. Reverend William Barber talks about how policy can be so destructive and how the state is completely complicit in both developing and carrying out or being negligent in terms of not stepping forward with policy to address some of the most important issues that we can imagine. We are having a reckoning with racism right now. Everybody across the country is recognizing that we have to come to grips with the institutionalized, the structural, the baked-in racism that we are experiencing the impact of right at this very moment. This reckoning with racism is something that has been needed for a very long time. So much of what we try to respond to in this country goes back to racism, unaddressed, but worse than unaddressed, unacknowledged. And unacknowledged to the point that we don't even talk about the origin story of the nation. This is a nation built on genocide, stolen land, human bondage, and slave labor. And the narrative, which is a narrative of a hierarchy of human value that was embraced during that time to be able to justify such horrific actions, but did not end with slavery, continues to this moment, a hierarchy that values some lives more than others. And we see it. We see it in education, we see it in health, we see it in criminal legal system, we see it all over. And while we're having this reckoning with racism, and so many corporate leaders and civic leaders and elected officials are saying, no more, it stops here. It's gotta be more than stopping it in the heart. It's gotta be more than just saying we're gonna do better going forward. We have to look back and see that so much of the apparatus, the ecosystem in which the nation functions has been so driven by a notion that some people are just not worth as much as others. And until we begin to reimagine these systems, bring our radical imaginations to developing a North Star that guides our every decision, we're going to continue to be plagued by a society that is not inclusive, that does not allow all to reach their full potential, and suffers because of it. The democracy suffers, our civic life suffers, our government suffers, the economy suffers. So to go more into this, we're going to be talking with Tony and Mona and David, and I'm going to start with Tony Iton and ask him to take this moment that we're in, Tony, around COVID and the economy and race, and how would you think about that in the context of policy violence?
Thank you, Angela. It's a real privilege to be on this panel. And I want to take a moment to just congratulate my colleague, Dr. Hannah Tisha. We're very proud of you from the moment that you stood up against the authorities in Flint, Michigan. You really inspired so many of us, so thank you. I wanted to start by, again, going back to Reverend Barber, who I first heard this concept of policy violence from. I wanted to just read a quote that sort of helps define what he means when he says policy violence. And he said, America is going to really have to wrestle with two questions. One, what does it say when a Black man can be downtown and end up choked to death by a cop? The second thing is that in this moment, while racism is certainly tied to George Floyd and his death, we cannot forget the policies that kill people every day as well. What I mean by that, this is him speaking still, there are thousands who die from the lack of healthcare, thousands who die from poverty, thousands who die from ecological destruction. Many of them are African-American and brown people. They die just the same. They just die slower than George Floyd, and we don't see the crushing weight of policy violence on their necks. If we're going to deal with racism, we cannot be a society that just talks about racism when somebody is shot or somebody has a knee on their neck. So the reason I like that quote is because it speaks to the horror of overt racism and the George Floyd moment that we all witnessed for that just incredibly long period of time on television before our eyes. But it also speaks to this sort of slower, more pernicious level of policy violence. And another colleague, Anna Diaz-Rue, who's the dean at Drexel School of Public Health, a long time ago referred to the absence of policy in the face of abject need. And to me, that is essentially what policy violence is. It's the absence of affirmative policy, knowing full well that the consequences of not having that policy will create suffering. And so the question for us in this moment is really, why does the US have amongst one of the worst outcomes in the world in COVID-19? Why are we having such an outrageously poor result? And we've seen that COVID-19 has moved like a heat-seeking missile into Black and brown bodies throughout this country. The pattern just replicates itself. And we know that this is producing enormous trauma in the lives of these populations. And that trauma is just like the trauma from regular physical violence. It has repercussions for individuals, for families, for communities. It can be passed on intergenerationally. So we live in a society, and this is essentially what Reverend Barber has been saying, that manufactures social vulnerability. We put people in harm's way routinely, and then we act surprised when they get harmed, like by COVID-19 or Hurricane Katrina or a foreclosure crisis or HIV/AIDS. The business that we are in out in California at the California Endowment is actually just mapping social vulnerability. We can predict where people will bear the brunt of harm because they are put in harm's way. So in our society, we also know that because it's not like this hasn't been studied. The societies that have the healthiest populations are those that invest most heavily in prevention. What does that look like? and this is getting to Dr. Hannah Atisha's comments, investing in prevention, a very excellent study done by Elizabeth Bradley and Lauren Taylor, which showed that the countries that have the greatest investment in social services and benefits, i.e., they create a strong social contract to anticipate need so that people don't get placed in harm's way, so that there's a buffer. Those countries that have the strongest social contracts, that have invested most in social benefits and in social services, have the best health. Those countries will weather COVID-19 better than the United States because we have left people directly in the path of harm. And we've done it intentionally. So ultimately, at the root of this, we have to ask ourselves this question about ourselves, the story of America, who we are. Why do we consciously place people in harm's way? Why do we do it again and again and again, despite the evidence? The answer has to be, and for many of the people who've looked at this issue, it's racism. It's the fact that we can't find social solidarity across various different groups. We have to create division. We have to stratify. We have to say some people are more valuable than others. And that's a narrative. Unfortunately, it's been carried by our current administration. That's a narrative that is anathema to creating essentially universal policies. So the lack of universal healthcare, the lack of universal childcare, the lack of a whole host of policies that every other major Western society has been able to accomplish is driven by this fundamental unwillingness to establish social solidarity, to create a united we in this country. And that's what is at the root of COVID-19 inequity and inequity writ large across virtually every major health outcome that we've looked at in this country.
Thank you so much, Tony. I want to turn to David Williams next, because one of the things that has been so clear is that Black people have tried very hard to be able to escape brutality and to find opportunity. And one of the times when that was most obvious was the Great Migration, when leaving lynching, leaving the crackdown after Reconstruction, leaving all of the oppression of the South, Black people started to go to the East, to the Midwest, to the West to try to find a better life. And what they found was a lot of the same that ended up segregating people, that we are so segregated in our cities because of so much policy work. And I know that you have been looking at segregation, your work and other work. Could you bring us into this conversation around how segregation has played such a role in terms of policy violence?
Thank you so much, Angela. I think of segregation as the secret sauce that has created racial inequities in the United States. I'll give you some examples of the high quality empirical evidence. William Julius Wilson and Robert Sampson, two eminent sociologists, studied the 171 largest cities in America back in the 1990s and concluded that there was not even one city where whites lived under equal conditions to Blacks, and they had this stunning statement that the worst urban context in which whites reside is considerably better than the average context of Black communities. That's the inequities that segregation has produced. More recently, my dear colleague, Dr. Dolores Acevedo Garcia at Brandeis, has created a neighborhood opportunity index, ranking on 24 different indicators: access to opportunity, high quality elementary education, access to employment opportunities, the quality of air and water and soil pollution and so on, access to green space and healthy food, 24 different indicators. And what she's able to demonstrate in the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, 2/3 of all African-American children, 58% of all Latino kids, and over 50% of all Native American kids are living in very low or low opportunity neighborhoods compared to 1 in 5 white and Asian kids. If we look at the opposite end, who is residing in high opportunity or very high opportunity neighborhoods, you find almost 2/3 of white and Asian kids and less than 1 in 5 African American and Latino kids are in high opportunity contexts. So these inequities have been created. How powerful are they? David Cutler, an economist at Harvard University, looking at national data for the United States, African Americans and whites, was able to show statistically, if we could eliminate residential segregation overnight, we would completely erase Black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce Black-white differences in single motherhood by 2/3. All of those striking social and economic differences are linked to opportunity at the neighborhood level. And if we wanted more evidence, more recently, Raj Chetty, another Harvard economist, has done an amazing study. He has looked using all census tracts for 1989 to 2015, and he's asked a simple question. Let's look at the African-American boys and girls and the white boys and girls. They are beginning life in households with the same level of income. How does the next generation fare when they start out with the same level of income? And he documents in 99% of all census tracts in America, Black boys earn less than their white counterparts, even when they started out at the same level of income. Why? They live in neighborhoods that differ in access to opportunity. Black boys do as well as white boys when they live in neighborhoods with good resources. The problem is that's true of only 1% of African-American children in the United States. So what we have to come to grips with the reality that the inequities we see, the racism we see, do not reflect a broken system. They instead reflect a carefully crafted system, functioning as planned, successfully implementing social policies, many of which are rooted in racism. They are not accidents. They're not acts of God. They're not random events. Racism, through these systemic mechanisms, has produced a truly rigged system in the United States, and we need to identify it and begin systematically to dismantle and mitigate the negative effects of these policies that have produced the inequities we face.
Thank you, David. I'm so anxious to get back and talk about all these things together, but I want to bring Dr. Hannah Atisha into this conversation. Mona, congratulations. What a wonderful award. And you're so deserving. You have made us all so proud. And your talk really demonstrated that while you have come to the public's attention because of your work in Flint around the water, that you have a very broad understanding of this society and what it does to children and the policy basis of those atrocities. Talk to us from the point of view of a pediatrician talking about policy violence.
Thank you, Angela. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. This is such an esteemed panel of really remarkable people. So I'm privileged and honored to be here with all of you. And I'm so excited to be here with the 600 plus folks that have joined us tonight. These virtual conferences are really hard. I'm a people person. I love physically being at APHA. You can feel the energy when there's thousands of people together who love public health. So I understand how hard it is to be at these kind of virtual events, but the warmth and the engagement, your commitment, your perseverance is absolutely felt. So it's great to be here. So, we're at an interesting space and place right now. So public health is absolutely in the spotlight. And I am hopeful, as I hope this conversation will show, that this is providing us with an opportunity to examine and reimagine our public health policies, which in light of COVID has unmasked to really more of the nation. It is absolutely a time, as Tony has mentioned, and Angela, of reckoning and really kind of rewriting these policies that were absolutely not accidental, especially for our children. So as a pediatrician, I have this really interesting perspective as somebody who lives in the world of healthcare and also in the world of health in public health. And it's been said that pediatricians are the ultimate witnesses to failed social policies. And as a pediatrician in Flint, as somebody who's trained in health policy, I can absolutely attest to that. You heard my story. You heard about our children who had lead, laced in their blood, and that was a preventable public health disaster. And it's too often in the bodies of our children and really in their blunted potential that we witness a failure of policies to respect science, to promote public health, and to eliminate inequities. And to me, this is criminal. It is violent, and it is a long-standing war that we have literally been waging on our children, especially on our brown and Black children. And like we said earlier, now with COVID, like eyes have begun to open to this kind of system that is fractured, that is unfair, that is unjust, that ultimately fails to care for each other. And I want to give you a few examples of how our policies have really put our children kind of on attack and have really made it impossible for many of them to reach their full potentials. And you can just turn on the news and you will see evidence of these policies, and it's absolutely devastating. So I mentioned earlier, in Flint it was poisoned water, and we know so much about lead. I can talk to you about 5 hours just about lead poisoning and how it has systemically impacted our most vulnerable children. This is actually Lead Poisoning Prevention Week, so that it's timely to talk about this again. I think if we were to do one thing to address anti-racism, it would be, on a list of many things, it would be to work towards lead elimination, because it continues to disproportionately impact our most vulnerable children. But throughout our nation, environmental racism and the industry-driven deliberate weakening of environmental protection makes it hard for so many kids all over to breathe clean air and to drink safe water. One of the leaders and founders of the environmental justice movement, Robert Bullard, said, some communities don't have the complexion for protection. That was true in Flint. That is true throughout our nation when it comes to environmental injustices. The dismissal and ridicule of science, especially in our fight against the climate crisis, will literally make catastrophic the world our children and their children will live in. And this is one of those examples of our failure to act, our failure to implement policies. We have immigrant kids, brown kids who want to come to this country, just like I was fortunate to come to this country, who are no longer able to come to this country. And when they get here, we are now separating these children from their parents. This has come back into the news. This is absolute government-sanctioned traumatic child abuse of brown children. We have children slaughtered in their schools, when they used to go to school because of policy paralysis on gun violence. We have failed to control this virus. And once again, that has led to a failure to provide educational opportunities for children. We didn't try hard enough to get our kids back in school. This has implications by widening education inequities, mental health trauma, food insecurity, and so much more. We've chronically failed to properly fund and resource our public schools. We mentioned, it's already been mentioned, the issue of poverty. Child poverty is damning. We have one of the highest child poverty rates of any industrialized country. We are the richest country in the history of the world, yet so many of our children grow up in poverty. And Flint has about a 60 to 70% child poverty rate. That's not okay. These are policy decisions. It doesn't have to be this way. We have a generation of racially driven mass incarceration that has deprived children of their parents. And as we mentioned, a criminal justice system that fails to value Black lives. The things kids need are always kind of on the thread of the chopping block, be it Medicaid or the ACA or CHIP or SNAP, and the list goes on. These are just basic fundamental safety net programs that are always at risk of getting cut. And then obviously kids don't grow up in isolation. They need parents with living wage jobs, with benefits like parental leave, sick leave, occupational health and safety, so they're not more at risk for things like COVID. And they need healthcare untethered to employment, because when folks do lose their jobs, like the situation that we're in right now, it shouldn't also mean the loss of their healthcare. So the list goes on. These are just a few examples of how our policies or our lack of policies have put so many of our children and really their potential at risk. And for me as a pediatrician, as a public health pediatrician, once again, trained in health policy, this is what keeps me up at night. Our policies have not only failed to be child-centric, they're almost child-phobic. One of my favorite quotes is by Charles Dickens, who in Great Expectations, so he was not only a novelist, but he was a child advocate. And he wrote, "In the little world in which children have their existence, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice that the child is exposed to, but the child is small and the world is small." But these are not small injustices. These are really large, purposeful injustices invading the small worlds of our kids. And they need large interventions, really a radical kind of reorienting of how we think about our kids, especially our most vulnerable kids. And I'm hopeful. I'm this eternal optimist because I think we're at a place where we have an opportunity to reimagine. In politics and policy making, there's windows of opportunity. And I'm hopeful that with this pandemic, that window has cracked open a bit. However, we need to all work together to bust it open, to really create a space to put into place science-driven, public health-driven, equity-driven policy interventions, especially on behalf of our children.
I thank you. And I'm going to come back and probe some of that hopefulness, and we're going to talk about solutions. But the three of you have really painted a stark picture, and one that could still be seen as disconnected in its analysis. So I want to connect it. I'm going to start with you, Tony, because you actually spoke more about health and about COVID and what it's shown. And you talked about the racism, but the racism doesn't just exist as an evil prejudice within the heart. It advanced economic interests. And we're seeing how those economic interests will not continue to advance because of racism. There's been a collision of racism and the economy, and we're seeing it right here as we're locked down. But its collision was starting even earlier as the country was plagued by toxic inequality, hollowing out the middle class, baking in poverty, stalling economic mobility. How do you see these things coming together, Tony?
Yeah, that's a great question. And quite honestly, I've read a lot of what you've written, Angela, on this issue, and I've really learned quite a bit. One of the things that has always struck me as sort of like a strange paradox is that racism has a lot of collateral damage. When you build a system around racism, it ends up having all of these unintended consequences in the larger population. I mean, universal healthcare is the most obvious one. That doesn't just impact Black and brown and people of color or immigrants. That impacts many of middle-class people who lose jobs or have a catastrophic car accident or, have a child born with a disability. And so, because we've been focused in this society for so long on trying to stratify opportunity to prevent really Blacks and other populations from having meaningful access to opportunity, we end up having all of these unintended consequences in the larger society. We also create enormous inefficiencies in our society as a whole. I'll never forget in 1993 when I was working on health reform. This was Clinton Care back in the day. And Lee Iacocca, who was the chairman of Chrysler, testified at Congress that we needed universal health care because he was putting $2,500 into every Chrysler that Japan didn't have to worry about, that Germany didn't have to worry about. And he was moving manufacturing to Canada because they had universal health care. And so the economic drag from all of these inefficiencies that have to be sort of piecemeal together through union benefits and various other plans, that's a product of racism. That's collateral damage from constructing essentially a society where we treat people differently, but we can't really anticipate all of the consequences of that. The last thing I'll say on this, this so-called deaths of despair, the roughly 500,000 excess deaths in US whites that have occurred over the past 20 or so years are a product of racism. Those are directly collateral injuries as a result of policy that fails to essentially embrace a sense of social solidarity across groups. And so the very same people who voted for the current president are actually experiencing some of the harshest consequences, the harshest collateral consequences of structural racism in our society. The irony is it's almost too perfect, but the reality is most people don't perceive it.
David, I really want to just pick right up on where Tony is leaving off, because he's actually showing how no matter what the intention, that we really are all interconnected. And when we place one part of our population at extreme risk, that risk bleeds out. And we have certainly seen that, I think, in terms of some of what you've been talking about in terms of segregation. And it goes both ways. We see that the negativity of what has been imposed on Black and brown families bleeds out into white families who have to live under the same policy conditions that were actually created to hold one group back, but they end up placing everybody at a disadvantage. But that it gets to a certain point where that disadvantage just doubles down on the population that has been already so isolated. And when I think about what's happening around suicide, that really seems to fit into this paradigm. Could you talk about all of these things?
Yeah, there's a lot here to unpack. I think you're absolutely correct, Angela, that the point that Tony is making is that racism actually has cost for whites as well. And it has put a ceiling on even the health of whites in the United States. A National Academy of Sciences report with Steve Wolf and others showed that even the best off Americans, those with a college degree who don't smoke and exercise regularly, have worse health than their counterparts in Europe. So all of us are suffering as a result of the burden of racism, but we can't lose sight of the fact of those who are suffering so much more deeply. Let me just build on that point, join on the work of Deborah Umberson. She shows, this is before COVID, that Black children, because of the racial inequities in health, a consequence means that Black children are 3 times as likely as their white counterparts to lose a mother by age 10. That Black adults are twice as likely to lose a child by age 30 or a spouse by age 60 compared to their white counterparts. So we are looking at a high level of bereavement, high levels of the loss of social ties, high levels of the loss of breadwinners, economic engines within the family and the community. And on top of that, we are superimposing the pandemic that is just causing so much more pain in our communities. And I'm glad you raised the point of suicide. Historically, for more than 100 years, it's been somewhat surprising to some researchers, African Americans have had lower rates of suicide than whites. And it doesn't seem to make sense. You would expect, you would predict the opposite would be true. But there are some recent studies that are quite disturbing. There are studies that are showing that even though the overall rate of suicide is lower for African Americans, suicide rates are increasing for African Americans, especially among young African Americans. And arguably one of the most disturbing studies is one that looked at national data over a 20-year period for suicide among elementary school children in the United States. And it showed that among elementary school children, national data for the US, suicide rates had declined for whites, were stable for Asians and Latinos, but had doubled for African Americans. And it raises the question that we need to grapple with. What does it mean to be African American growing up in this racist society today where there are so many signs and it's so overwhelming Brendisha Tynes from USC has done research showing that among Latinx and African American young people, the more frequently they report they have seen videos of someone of their own racial or ethnic group being arrested, being beaten, being abused by the police, the higher the rates of PTSD and depression. What are we doing to this generation with what we are exposing them to, with this constant barrage of injustice and inequities and the pain and suffering that is causing our young people?
Mona, you actually touched on almost every aspect of what we're talking about. Even at the end, I was going to ask you, but then you brought it in as a pediatrician focusing on children. What about their families? What about their communities? And you started to talk about that. But I'd like for you to talk about it more, because sometimes in society, we hold the children in a very precious way, even if we don't treat them like they're precious. When we begin to have conversations, it's as if, well, everybody knows that we have to do right by the children, but these children, they live with adults. They live with aunts and uncles and parents. They live in communities with people who are abused and isolated and knocked down every time they try to do something. How do all these things fit together? And how do you think about the issues that David was just talking about in terms of the mental health of our children?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what David said. And this is what we see. And this is kind of what we are recognizing in kind of this emerging science of early adversity and toxic stress, and how I mentioned so many kids are just poisoned by inequity. It's like, yeah, in Flint, it was our water, but so many of our children are growing up in situations where it is near impossible for them to overcome. And for me, my kids in Flint, like they're literally waking up to nightmares. And, I talk a lot about kind of this concept of the American dream, especially as being an immigrant who is like, very fortunate to have been a recipient of the American dream. And if you look at history, Flint, Michigan was the birthplace of the middle class with the automotive company, and some argue the birthplace of the American dream. Yet our kids in Flint, because of these purposeful, historic, geographic policy decisions, wake up to nightmares. And that is not unique to kids all over this country that wake up to circumstances beyond their control, that are of despair. And it is no doubt that, kids pick up on everything. Kids are so smart, and they can see the hopelessness. They can see, that their zip code, and they can see that it's almost kind of their trajectory is marked by those environments. And for so long, kind of my work as a pediatrician has been focused on that individual child, because, maybe because of that training in individual health and, being one-on-one with that kid. And we talk a lot about kind of building resilience in our kids, and we celebrate resilience. There's a quote that I love from a kid in Philadelphia who, despite all the obstacles of growing up kind of in the projects in Philadelphia, where some of his friends were shot and killed, he went on to become a Rhodes Scholar. And there's a quote that he had in the paper that said, "Don't be happy for me that I overcame these barriers. Be mad as hell they exist in the first place." And I love that. And that has really kind of taught me to pivot my work, that we should not be kind of celebrating kind of this grit and resilience of children who are suffering life's hardest blows. It's not going to be expected. And it speaks so much to kind of this American love of individualism. And it's all about I, and me, he can lift himself up. And that's not how it works. Rather, we need to focus on how do we build these environments so that children, especially our most vulnerable children, don't have to lean on things like resilience, that we are, building communities around them that offer them and support them so that they don't need to have that innate grit that so many of our children don't need to have.
Mona, how does policy begin to move us in that direction? So you've got it, and we've done a good job of talking about how this is policy violence. What should we be doing to overcome policy violence and replace it with a system that loves, that nourishes, that enables?
Yeah, so sometimes I say, like, the most potent prescription I can prescribe to my patients and their families are living wage jobs for their parents. So it's, it's economic development. It's advocating for things like the universal basic income, living wages, employment that has benefits like, health and safety precautions, parental leaves and sick leaves. We talked already about education. Our education system is segregated. It's poorly funded. Our teachers are working multiple jobs. We need to, as a society, put into place the policies that invest in our education system. We talked about healthcare. Healthcare should not be tethered to employment. It should be, separate. It should be universal. It should be free of racial disparities. We need stronger environmental health regulations. We need to finally eliminate lead exposure. These are the society policy level things that we can do to make sure that our children grow up in resilient places rather than burdening them with the necessity to be resilient themselves.
Mm-hmm. David, and I'm working my way back to you, Tony, because I know you think about this too. But David, I know that we probably will all lay out pretty much the same policy initiatives. We know we need universal health care and child care, and we ought to view housing as a human right. We have a whole list of things. Federal job guarantee is one that I've been pushing a lot. But we actually have to change the narrative in this country, don't we, in order to get there? There's an example that I like to use, and that is the GI Bill. The GI Bill is an amazing example of stepping up in a huge, no stinginess associated with it. Here is the GI Bill laying out educational opportunities and home buying opportunities for all of the 16 million returning veterans to be able to take advantage of. Now, of course, it was implemented in a racist way and everybody didn't get to take advantage of it, but it made the white middle class because America stepped up and invested in the people who were going to be the future to help them in the ways that they needed help. That was a mindset of let's help these white men who are coming back into communities to be successful. What do we need to do, David, to get ourselves in the right mindset so we can implement the policy agenda that each and every one of us can rattle off?
We need a new mindset. We need a new narrative. I go back to W.E.B. Du Bois. He wrote in 1899, The Philadelphia Negro. He has a chapter in there on Negro health that shows the stark disparities, just as Tony talked about them tonight. They existed back in 1899. But as Du Bois came towards the end of the chapter, he said something profound. He said the most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is the peculiar attitude of the nation toward the well-being of the race. And he continued, there have been few other cases in the history of civilized peoples where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. So he is saying the fundamental problem we face in the United States with these inequities by race is simply put, he called it a peculiar indifference. We don't care as a society. And it goes back to how we value some lives and not others. We do not care. And scientists today study what Du Bois called the peculiar indifference, and they call it the empathy gap. And research shows that at 5 years old, white children in America, there is no empathy gap. You show them the pain and suffering of a Black person or a white person, they say equally, everyone experiencing the same amount of pain. By age 7, there is the tendency. By age 10, it is pronounced. There is a stable, reliable empathy gap. We can get it from self-report data. We can get it by looking at brain imagery. We care and we feel the suffering and pain of what happens to our group, but not what happens to those people over there. So we really face a challenge of how do we tell the story of the challenges of the disadvantage in a way that emotionally connects with our population, because without empathy, we also don't have the policy preferences. We don't support the policies that would change the realities on the ground that we've been talking about tonight. So I really think we need to build some human connection and figure out ways to more effectively break down this empathy gap, this peculiar indifference that Du Bois so articulated back in 1899.
Thank you, Tony. I know that you agree with the empathy part, but I also hear you talk a lot about power. Your work at the California Endowment, in some ways, has really brought power into philanthropy as strategy for moving forward. Do you want to talk some about that now in this context of how we address policy violence?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. And this is such a fascinating conversation. I really enjoy hearing from my colleagues. This question of agency, what we call power agency, and we in California at the endowment spent almost $2 billion, $1.8 billion over about 12 years in our Building Healthy Communities effort. And we took away from that three things. And those three things were, we call the ABCs of our work. And A stands for agency. Agency is essentially power, the ability to essentially exercise your voice and have control over what happens to you. What Dr. Hannah Atisha described and what David describes in segregated communities, people are buffeted by just all kinds of influences happening to them, and they lack a sense of any agency or control over what's happening to them. And we found in our work that you can actually build agency at the individual, at the family, at the community level by organizing people and essentially focusing their power and helping them hold systems accountable. So the A of ABCs is agency, and you can increase agency at the community level. We have story after story after story. In fact, the civil rights movement was all about increasing agency and power. But the second thing that's important is the B, which I think was a kind of an interesting finding, and it pertains very much to what we're talking about today. B stands for belonging. And that's a sense of being seen, being heard, having your story known to the larger society, having your humanity recognized by others. And the way that you increase belonging is through narrative. And we have a number of examples in California of how we've changed the narrative on undocumented Californians, on formerly incarcerated Californians, on boys and men of color, on LGBTQ, on rural communities, where we let people tell their stories and to essentially share their humanity. Let them become the architects of their own stories. That's absolutely critical. And then the C in the ABC is really what Dr. Hannah Atisha was talking about so brilliantly. I mean, I actually looked up the quote for the young man who, this whole notion of sort of people having to beat the odds, as opposed to the notion of changing the odds. If the odds are man-made, they're policy-mediated odds, and we can change them. So rather than celebrating those that actually have the resilience to make it through this horrible minefield that we create for them, let's clear the minefield so that more people can make it through. So that's what we learned for $1.8 billion. And I want the listeners, the participants in this session to leave feeling hopeful. And the story that I tell, that I enjoy telling, and Angela, you're from California too, I tell people, look, I'm from California, therefore I'm from the future. What happens to us today will happen to you tomorrow. And so just watch us. We've changed the narrative in California. And as a consequence, we have a whole host of more inclusive policies. We include undocumented children in our full scope Medicaid program here, up until the age of 26. We're working to get 65 and over included, and then ultimately all undocumented people. We've eliminated cash bail. We've got a ballot issue now to sort of keep that going. We've got undocumented people who can become lawyers and doctors, take the bar, practice medicine, get in-state tuition. We've eliminated a whole host of felonies for over 1 million people who can now reclassify as misdemeanors and don't have to check the box on housing applications or for employment. So California is on the move, and we believe that California is the leading edge of the United States, and that, just watch us. What we're doing is, and it's not perfect, we have a lot of work to do around housing, we have a lot of work to do around a lot of other areas, but we're changing the narrative. We're building that bigger we. And the temptation is, and this is the danger in this work, is to blame those people who support the current president, those people that don't understand, diversity or equity. And we have to not fall into that trap. We have to love We have to embrace, we have to build a larger we. Our fates are inextricably intertwined. In order to successfully build the kind of solidarity that we need for universal policies, we're going to have to embrace even some of the people and some of the institutions that harmed us for tens, if not hundreds of years in the past.
Absolutely. I am with you in terms of being proud of California. And one of the things that I'm proud of at the moment, and I'm also with you, we've got a long way to go. I never want people to think when we praise California that we don't see the poverty and suffering. We do, but we are on a track. And something good just happened recently, and that is that regarding the reopening of the economy, California now has a policy of having an equity metrics as part of the calculation that the counties have to engage in order to continue to reopen the economy. And what it does is it says it's not looking at deaths and hospitalizations, because those are the last things to show improvement. But we know that COVID-19 is disproportionately hitting Latino and African American and Pacific Island communities hard. And so counties have to show that they're doing more testing in those communities. They're doing more contact tracing in those communities, that they're actually spending the state and federal money disproportionately in those communities, so that they are having to demonstrate that they're putting their resources and building the capacity in those communities, more campaigns around wash your hands, wear a mask, social distance, doing the things that help to address the problem where it is most acute. And that is something that every county in California has to do. And the reward for doing it is, one, you get to stay open in a more sustainable way, but also you can move a little faster around the reopening process by making it clear that you are paying attention to equity. Having an equity metrics that they have to use is a classic example of a policy that really embraces inclusion and equity and goes out to try to do something about it. David and Mona, I want to bring you both in to talk about, what do you want to see us do?
I guess I would just mention two things of what I would like us to do. And the first is around justice. So as a profession in Flint, there's a lot of discussion about like truth and accountability and investigations and lawsuits and who did what. And I used to be really kind of removed from those conversations. People would ask me like, who should go to jail? Who do you think was blamed for our public health crisis? And I'd be like, oh, talk to the lawyers, talk to the attorney generals. I'm just a doctor taking care of kids. And then the more I, began to interact and treat patients and work with the community, the more I began to realize how this concept of restorative justice is actually part of health and healing. And this is not just for Flint, but really this is for our nation. For me, I think of it like a wound that never heals and stays open if we have trauma after trauma without having some element of justice. We need to start by looking back. We talked earlier about kind of the history and kind of the reckoning of our history. Our kids do not know American history. They think after slavery ended, everything was okay. So that's why this moment that we're in with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, it actually is inspiring and hopeful for me, because I see a movement that sprung from that moment that is broader than it's ever been historically. And I really kind of credit a lot of folks to now being kind of woke to our American history. So now that we are kind of more aware of that history, I hope we come to a point where there is a reckoning and an element of justice. And if that means more resources or reparations or what have you to address these longstanding injustices. And this comes from kind of firsthand experiences, because if there's not some sort of closure, if there's not some sort of justice, the trauma, the wound is real and it is raw. So that's kind of one element that I hope we start to think of as a nation to getting to that point of restorative justice. And the next thing I want to kind of add to what Tony said about kind of inclusion and being at the table and having a role in participatory democracy and self-determination. So you get to determine kind of the where your community is going. And to me, this is about democracy and having representation. And another part of my story, the Flint story, is a story of democracy usurped. Emergency management came in, took over kind of the will of the people. It was against kind of a statewide initiative and the most gerrymandered legislature in the state. And there was folks in charge who are unelected and unaccountable. So a really egregious example of what happens when you deny and you dismiss the voices at the table, where you take away democracy. But that is no different than other efforts that are happening throughout that are purposefully taking away people's voices, be it voter suppression or voter ID laws or mass incarceration or gerrymandering or the list goes on. These are all purposeful efforts that make it really, really hard for people to organize and to be heard. So I think we also have to recognize the critical role that democracy has in health and in restoring the health of our communities and being a tool in anti-racism.
David?
Yeah, I want to agree with Mona. I think that we have to act, and we can all begin by voting. So that's one, but that's just the first step. We need to vote. But I think Martin Luther King said profoundly, it may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people. We cannot be silent. We cannot be indifferent. We are in a moment of national reckoning, and we have to take advantage of this opportunity. I like the way Barack Obama put it. He said, Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Barack said, it doesn't bend on its own. We have to come together and bend the arc of justice. And I think this is a moment of truth. There's a greater moment of awareness of systemic injustice, of systemic racism. I'm so amazed to hear everyone using these terms now. We need to build momentum and take advantage of this opportunity so that we can get kind of the sustained policy changes we've all been talking about tonight.
I'm going to just quickly summarize what we've been saying, but I want to give anybody on this panel an opportunity to weigh in a last time before I do. Tony, Mona, David, if there's anything else you want to say before I wrap it up.
I would just add, Angela, and this has been such a huge pleasure for me. Really appreciate my co-panelists. This notion of truth, healing, and reconciliation is really central to this question. We can't go forward the same way that we've come. And we have to understand how we got to where we are. We have to tell the truth. And this gets down to even places like California who think of themselves as fair and futuristic and all about idealistic opportunity. California has a nasty history of racism and genocide. Racism against African Americans and genocide against Native Americans. Its very founding was a story of genocide against Native Americans. We started to tell that story in California. We have to tell the story of all of the segregationist policy that followed African Americans to California. So telling the truth about where we've been in every society that's had to make a major pivot. You look at South Africa, even look at Russia and the former Soviet Union. They had to, at some point, have some accounting for how they got to where they are and hold, at least bear the truth. And so that's critical to the United States. We still can't acknowledge the crimes against so many different populations that have occurred. And until we do that, we cannot move forward in an equitable way.
Thank you. Anybody else? I thank you. This has been it's been a pleasure and an honor to be with you, to have this conversation. And I hope that all of the people who are listening are walking away really absorbing how horrendous the policymaking has been in this country on a huge swath of the population that the nation is now dependent upon. The future of the nation depends on what happens to the very people who have been left behind. So that all of these policies that have just built one on top of the other, they are now harming the entire nation. And so we have a moral imperative, an economic imperative, and a national imperative to be able to address this and move forward. Tony is right, Mona's right, David is right. We're not going to do it until we acknowledge how we got here. It is a horrible story, but in telling that story, we begin to understand what we have to let go of and what we have to overcome. And in looking to the future, we actually are so fortunate to be in a nation in which we have so much wealth. We have so much capacity. We have so much knowledge, so many models of what it's going to take to build a fully inclusive nation in which all can reach their full potential. We have models in health, in education, in the justice system. We have models in terms of how to have communities that are not segregated, how to have transit systems that actually connect everybody in the region. We have models for all of it. What we lack is public will. What we lack is an alignment of the wealth of the nation with the future of the nation. What we need is empathy, but what we also need is for the communities that see and need a way forward to step into their power, to own this nation, to be leaders of the nation, to not on the outside stand making demands, but to step into the leadership roles as you're making demands. Step into your power, step into your leadership. The public health community is such a partner in all of this because you have the ability to see and to understand and to be able to use your positions, your voice, your work to be able to tell a different story about America. Because if we tell a different story, we can then create a different story. It's going to take all of the systems stepping outside of their comfort zone, all of the people pushing toward a North Star that we have never achieved. We have never been fully inclusive, but we do have models for how to get there if we piece everything that we know together. I thank all of you, and I thank the panelists, and I hope you have a good evening. Thank you very much.
That was a great discussion. Please join me in giving our moderator, Ms. Angela Glover Blackwell, and our panel a great round of virtual applause. Now, as we close out this session, I want to remind you all to attend the virtual exhibit hall, as well as the award ceremony on Tuesday at 6:30 Mountain Time, and the closing session on Wednesday, 2:30 Mountain Time. Have a wonderful rest of your day.